Have you ever seen these signs for radioactive fallout shelters in New York? And did you also know that they were never going to work and scientists and the government knew that? So I want to talk about that and how, in spite of it, they got built. In 1947, the Cold War began between the US and USSR, but by 1955, the USSR had about 200 nuclear weapons and the US had about 10 times that amount. But the big thing here was that if they were going to drop a bomb on each other, they would need to use bombers, giving each other hours' notice that something was going to happen. So the US began Operation Alert in 1954, which was a national civil defense exercise which involved evacuating major cities or having populations go into shelters. On top of that, in 1955, New York State made it a law that you had to participate in Operation Alert or you could face a year in jail or a $500 fine. Immediately, there was opposition from radical Catholic groups due to religious opposition, like the Catholic Worker led by Dorothy Day, and the NAACP, because in 1950, the Federal Civil Defense Administration's first leader was selected to be Mallard Caldwell, the former governor of Florida and a staunch Southern segregationist who made sure that Jim Crow laws were enforced on evacuation drills and shelter programs. Yeah, the NAACP was like, oh, we're doing Jim Crow and post-nuke society? Yeah, we'd rather not participate. One of the points made by the Catholic workers' pamphlets that were handed out before protests is there was no such thing as winning a nuclear war, and therefore civil defense was just made to normalize the idea of nuclear war to the citizens of the United States. Dorothy Day would participate in protests up until 1962 when Operation Alert was ended. Why was it ended? Because of the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which made it impossible to evacuate or adequately protect any civilian population from a nuclear attack. So as the 1960s rolled around, nuclear war became a real possibility. So the US government needed to find a way to convince the public that this was a real tactical, viable option. So how were they going to do that? Well, they were going to normalize it first and then make people feel like they could survive. And they tried to accomplish both of those things through fallout shelters. Interestingly, the United States viewed surviving war as a consumer choice, so fallout shelters started as a kit that you could purchase and install in your basement or backyard. And because of zoning and housing discrimination at the time, that meant that the only people who were theoretically going to survive a nuclear apocalypse were people that lived in suburbs who were all white and politically influential. At its peak, it was estimated there were over 200,000 private fallout shelters across the United States, but almost immediately people started to realize that leaving sheltering against government warfare to private individuals was immoral on a bunch of fronts, as evidenced by one of the most famous articles in Time magazine history, Gun Thy Neighbor, a debate between citizens and religious clergy about the morality of killing someone trying to get into your fallout shelter. This article had two main groups of opinions: the majority, which said it was immoral to not help shelter your neighbor, and the minority, which said they would rather kill their neighbor than let them shelter with them. This put a bad taste in the mouth of America, and it led to 93% of American households not planning on ever getting a fallout shelter. In 1961, the federal government under JFK freed up a couple $100 million for public shelter programs, and this was under the guise of addressing racial and economic inequality in sheltering. But the reality is it probably had more to do with the fact that Nelson Rockefeller, the current governor of New York, had a weird obsession with fallout shelters, according to the Prime Minister of India, and petitioned JFK to institute a public shelter program. Nelson Rockefeller was anticipated to be the Republican nominee for the presidential race at the time, and so JFK was trying to make sure that he appeared anti-communist as much as Nelson Rockefeller did. Why was Nelson Rockefeller so obsessed with fallout shelters? Well, we can try to connect some dots. Joseph Carlino, who was the Speaker for the Assembly of New York, rushed a piece of legislation through to get it approved, and then it would turn out he had a vested interest in a fallout shelter company and would be investigated for conflicts of interest. But Nelson Rockefeller also could have just seen it as a legitimate business interest, because at this point, these fallout shelters didn't make sense and had very little efficacy. That's because there's a couple problems. The public shelters with these signs on the side of the building are only radioactive fallout shelters and do not protect you from any sort of blast, firestorm, toxic chemicals in the air that could kill you well before radioactive fallout ever had a chance to have any sort of effect. And almost 100% of them are located in or near locations deemed nuclear strike targets. So you would very well be killed by the nuclear blast before the fallout shelter could help you do anything. On top of that, all of these duck and cover exercises that were developed in the 1950s happened at a time where it was only expected a single weapon would be detonated at a time. But by the time these shelters were being built, hundreds of weapons could have been deployed at a moment's notice and annihilated entire population centers. So what the hell was the point of these shelters? Well, they were simply propaganda to get the US public on board if the US went to nuclear war, because they would think it was a viable military action, because the US had cared enough about them to build these shelters in city centers that were vulnerable to attack. But in reality, if attack happened, these shelters would have done nothing for them. Which makes this video produced by the Office of Emergency Management last year about what to do in a nuclear detonation that much more hilarious. They tell you to go inside and go to your basement, which provides about as much protection as those fallout shelters do. But who is this for? Morristown, New Jersey? Montauk, Long Island? Because those are the only people I can think of who would give a flying fuck about radioactive radioactive fallout if this actually happened. So just remember, kids, recognize propaganda when you see it, and there is no winning when you use nuclear weapons.